If someone told you that the most widely accepted idea about the origin of everything might collapse under pure logic alone, no emotion, no faith, no rebellion, you would probably dismiss it. But that is exactly what we are about to explore. Because when the idea of an all-powerful, eternal, all-knowing creator is followed to its final logical conclusion, something unusual happens. Logic itself begins to strain under its own weight. This is not about belief or disbelief. This is about the same kind of logic that built your smartphone, landed spacecraft on distant planets, and decoded the human genome. The same logic that drives modern science seems to have something uncomfortable to say about how we explain existence itself. It begins with a simple, almost ordinary moment. Imagine being a child sitting at a dinner table. Someone tells you that God created everything. Naturally, you ask the most obvious question a curious mind can ask: who created God? And the answer comes quickly, almost automatically: no one. God has always existed. God has no beginning. As a child, you accept it, not because you fully understand it, but because the moment passes, the conversation moves on, and life continues. Yet that question doesn't truly disappear. It stays somewhere in the background of the mind, waiting. What is striking is that this idea is not unique to one culture or one era. Across civilizations, continents, and thousands of years, humans have arrived at a very similar conclusion. There must be a first cause, something that started everything without itself being started. The Egyptians spoke of Ra. The Greeks described the unmoved mover. Abrahamic traditions speak of a personal God. Other philosophies describe an infinite, uncaused source or universal consciousness. Different names, different stories, but the same underlying intuition. The universe cannot explain itself, so something must exist beyond it to explain everything else. Philosophers later formalized this intuition into what is called the cosmological argument. At its core, it sounds logical and even elegant. If everything that exists has a cause, then the chain of causes must end somewhere. There must be something that does not require a cause, something eternal, something necessary, something that simply is. And at first glance, it feels almost impossible to reject. But this is where things start to get interesting, because the moment you slow down and examine what is actually being claimed, the argument begins to shift in subtle but important ways. We are no longer just talking about whether everything has a cause. We are now talking about whether it is valid to stop the demand for explanation at a specific point and declare that one thing alone is exempt. The key question nobody asks is simple but powerful. Why does the explanation stop at God? Think about it carefully. When we look at the universe, we are disturbed by the fact that anything exists at all instead of nothing. That feeling is not irrational. It pushes us toward explanation. Complexity seems to demand explanation. Order seems to demand explanation. So we introduce God as the ultimate explanation. But then something unusual happens. God is not introduced as something simple. In most theological descriptions, God is described as infinitely powerful, infinitely intelligent, infinitely knowledgeable, and capable of intention, thought, planning, judgment, and love. In other words, not simple at all, but the most complex entity imaginable. Now the tension becomes unavoidable. If complexity in the universe requires explanation, then why does infinite complexity suddenly not require one? Why does the demand for explanation disappear at the exact moment we name it God? What has quietly happened is that we have replaced one mystery with another. It is like explaining a small flame by pointing to the sun. And when someone then asks where the sun comes from, the answer becomes, the sun just exists. It needs no explanation. But that is not an answer. It is simply moving the mystery one level higher and declaring it off limits. This problem was noticed long ago by philosophers like David Hume. He pointed out a serious logical tension. If the universe is so complex that it requires a designer, then the designer, being even more complex, would require an even greater explanation. And that leads to an endless chain with no clear stopping point. Theological responses try to resolve this by saying God is simple in a philosophical sense, meaning not made of parts, but that creates a new difficulty. A being that supposedly knows every particle in the universe, every human thought, every possible future outcome simultaneously, is not what most people would normally describe as simple. So the question returns again in a sharper form. If the universe needs an explanation, why doesn't God? And the moment you say God does not need an explanation, you have introduced a special exception into your reasoning, one that is not justified by the logic that led you there. This is where the argument starts to split, because the same principle that demands a cause for everything is suddenly no longer applied universally. And once that exception is made, the structure of the argument becomes unstable, in a way that is hard to ignore. To be fair, this is not where the discussion ends, because the argument for a creator is not just a vague intuition. It exists in a much stronger, more structured form known as the Kalam cosmological argument. And if we want to evaluate it honestly, we have to look at its strongest version, not a simplified one. The argument goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And that cause, being outside space and time, immensely powerful and responsible for creation itself, is what we call God. At first, this reasoning feels tightly structured, especially when we consider modern cosmology. The Big Bang model strongly suggests that the universe as we know it had a beginning around 13.8 billion years ago. Before that point, as far as our current physics can describe, there was no space, no time, and no classical matter in the way we understand it. So the idea that the universe began is not random speculation. It is grounded in scientific models. And if something begins, it is reasonable to ask what caused it. So far, the argument feels solid. But then comes the critical step, the one that changes everything. The cause of the universe is then described not just as a cause, but as a personal, conscious agent, a mind that chooses, decides, and acts intentionally. The justification given is that only a mind could initiate an action without being triggered by prior physical conditions. A mechanical cause would always produce its effect automatically, but a conscious agent can choose when to act. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, but if we examine it carefully, we notice something important has been added without clear justification. We move from the universe has a cause to the cause is a conscious, personal being with intention. That is not a direct logical conclusion. It is an additional assumption layered on top of the original argument. Why must the cause be conscious? Why must it be personal? Why must it have intention, morality, or awareness of human existence? None of these properties follow necessarily from the idea of a first cause. They are interpretive additions, shaped more by human intuition than strict logic. And once you see this step clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee it. The argument has not only identified a cause, it has also assigned specific human-like qualities to it, without proving that those qualities are required. This creates a deeper issue. The entire structure of the argument depends on one key principle. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. But if that principle is absolute, then it raises a difficult question. What about God? The usual answer is that God did not begin to exist. God is eternal, outside time, and therefore not subject to causation. But if we accept that, we have now allowed something to exist without a cause. And once that exception is granted, we must ask why that exception cannot apply elsewhere, perhaps to the universe itself, or to a more fundamental physical reality. At this point, the argument no longer resolves the question. It simply relocates the mystery and assigns it a label. Once that exception is accepted, the entire structure of the argument begins to reveal a deeper tension. If it is valid to say that God does not require a cause because God is eternal, then we have already made a very important move. We have accepted that something can exist without a cause. But that immediately raises a difficult question. If one thing can be exempt from causation, why must that exemption belong only to God? Why not the universe itself? Why not a more fundamental layer of reality that simply exists without beginning, without cause, without external explanation? At this point, the distinction starts to look less like logic and more like selection. We are choosing where to stop the chain of explanation rather than discovering a necessary stopping point. Modern physics adds an even more uncomfortable layer to this discussion. In quantum mechanics, the idea of strict causality becomes far less clear than in everyday experience. At the quantum level, events do not always behave like predictable dominoes falling from prior causes. For example, radioactive decay does not occur at a predictable moment because of a hidden mechanical trigger. Instead, it occurs probabilistically. The exact moment is not determined by a classical cause in the way we intuitively expect. This does not mean anything happens for no reason in a chaotic sense, but it does challenge the idea that causation must always resemble a simple chain of physical triggers. Even more importantly, what we casually call nothing in everyday language is not what physics describes. The quantum vacuum is not empty in the philosophical sense. It is a structured, fluctuating field filled with activity, energy, and potentiality. Particles can emerge from it without a classical cause in the traditional sense. So when people say something cannot come from nothing, physics complicates the meaning of both something and nothing. Cosmology also explores models where the universe may not have a classical beginning in the way we imagine. Some proposals suggest that time itself may be finite in one direction, but not in a simple starting point sense. Others propose cyclic models or frameworks where the concept of a single initial cause becomes less clear. There are also interpretations where all mathematically consistent structures can be considered to exist in some form, meaning existence is not something that begins or ends, but something far more abstract. In these approaches, the question, what caused the universe, may not have a straightforward answer, not because the answer is hidden, but because the structure of the question itself may not apply cleanly at the deepest level of reality. And this is where the contrast becomes sharp. On one side, the argument for God introduces an uncaused, necessary being to stop infinite regress. On the other side, physics and cosmology explore frameworks where the universe or underlying reality may itself be fundamental in a similar way. So the real question is no longer simply, does everything need a cause? But rather, why is one uncaused existence considered more acceptable than another? Because once the rule is relaxed for one case, the justification for restricting it to only that case becomes much harder to defend purely on logical grounds. When we push this question further, we reach a point where intuition starts to break down completely. We are no longer dealing with everyday cause and effect. We are trying to apply human-style reasoning to the origin of reality itself, where even basic ideas like before and after become uncertain. To understand this, imagine the idea of absolute nothingness, not empty space, not darkness, not silence, but the complete absence of space, time, energy, laws, or even possibility. True nothingness in the strictest sense. Now try to picture it. The moment you attempt it, your mind automatically fills the gap. You imagine a black void, or a silent empty room, or a limitless space. But all of those are still something. They contain structure, geometry, or at least a background in which things could exist. This reveals something important about human thinking. Our imagination cannot truly represent absolute nothingness, because imagination itself requires some form of existence to operate within. Now introduce the idea of a creator acting before the universe. The word before already assumes time. But if time itself begins with the universe, then before loses its meaning. There is no earlier moment if time itself does not exist. So when we say God existed before the universe, we are already using language that may not apply to the situation we are trying to describe. Then we face another problem. If God is described as a mind, a conscious agent that decides, plans, and chooses, those concepts normally require time, sequence, and mental processing. Thoughts occur in order. Decisions involve comparison. Action implies change from one state to another. But if God is truly outside time, then none of these processes can function in the way we understand them. A timeless mind becomes a concept that is extremely difficult to define without contradiction. At this stage, a serious philosophical tension emerges. The more we try to remove God from physical limitations, the more we also remove the possibility of describing or understanding God in coherent terms. And this leads to a striking conclusion. A being defined in a way that places it beyond all observation, beyond all physical interaction, and beyond all logical constraint becomes indistinguishable, in practical terms, from something we cannot test, measure, or differentiate from non-existence. To make this clearer, imagine a perfectly undetectable dragon in a garage. It produces no heat, no sound, no physical effect, and leaves no trace. There is no possible experiment that could distinguish its presence from its absence. In that case, the distinction between a dragon exists and no dragon exists becomes meaningless in practice. This is not a claim about dragons. It is an illustration of a deeper principle. If something cannot, even in principle, affect reality in any detectable or logical way, then it becomes indistinguishable from nothing within the framework of reason. And this brings us back to the central tension in the idea of a non-physical, non-temporal creator. The more completely we define it as beyond all constraints, the less it functions as an explanatory tool. Instead of solving the mystery of existence, it risks becoming a label placed on the mystery without actually reducing it. At this point, the discussion shifts from simple causation to something deeper. What counts as a meaningful explanation at all, and whether an explanation that cannot be examined is truly an explanation in any practical or logical sense. To understand why this matters, we need to look at how explanations actually work in science and human knowledge. Throughout history, our understanding of reality has expanded not by introducing untestable entities, but by replacing unknowns with mechanisms that can be observed, modeled, and refined. At the surface level of everyday experience, causation seems simple. One event leads directly to another. You drop something, it falls. You strike a match, it burns. This classical view of the world feels intuitive and complete, and for a long time it formed the foundation of physics. But as science moved deeper, this simplicity began to change. At the quantum level, reality behaves in ways that do not fit classical expectations. Events are not always determined by clear, linear causes. Instead, probability becomes fundamental. Outcomes are described in terms of likelihoods rather than fixed certainties. This does not mean reality is random in a chaotic sense, but it does mean that the old idea of strict mechanical causation is not universal. As physics continues to develop, even the concept of laws becomes more subtle. What we call laws of nature may not be commands imposed from outside, but descriptions of patterns emerging from deeper structures we are still trying to understand. Some theories in modern cosmology suggest that what we perceive as the universe could be one expression of a much larger mathematical framework, where existence is not something that is caused in the traditional sense, but something that emerges from deeper consistency rules. In such views, asking for an external cause of the universe may be similar to asking what is north of the North Pole. The question assumes a structure that may not apply at the deepest level. Across all of this, a pattern appears. As our knowledge expands, explanations tend to move away from intentional agents and toward impersonal processes, mathematical structures, and self-consistent systems. This does not automatically disprove any philosophical or theological idea, but it does show that we have powerful alternative ways of understanding existence without introducing a conscious designer as a necessary step. And this is where the deeper philosophical shift happens. The question is no longer only about what caused the universe, but about what kind of explanation is actually needed or meaningful. Because if reality can be described through self-consistent physical and mathematical principles, then the idea of stopping explanation at a personal creator becomes one option among others, rather than a required conclusion. And once that is recognized, the original certainty behind the idea of a necessary divine stopping point becomes much less stable than it first appeared.